Look, I've been around long enough to know that sometimes life kicks you square in the teeth when you least expect it. But what happened to me at Sunset Manor Retirement Home? That was something else entirely. I'm telling you this story because somebody needs to, and because what went down there changed everything for a bunch of old Air Force guys who thought their fighting days were behind them. My name's Robert Dutch Henderson, and I spent 32 years in the United States Air Force. Flew F-4 Phantoms over Vietnam, later transitioned to training pilots at Nellis. Retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1995. Figured I'd done my bit for God and country. My wife Sarah and I had a good run after that, 23 years of fishing, grandkids, and quiet Sunday mornings. Then Sarah passed in 2018. Cancer took her quick, and suddenly this big house felt like a mausoleum. My daughter Linda started with the gentle suggestions first. Dad, maybe you'd be happier somewhere with people your own age. Then came the not-so-gentle pressure. Dad, you fell twice last month. What if something happens and nobody finds you for days? Finally, she just laid it out straight. Dad, I found 3 burned pots in your kitchen this week. You're scaring me. So that's how I ended up at Sunset Manor in Phoenix, Arizona in the spring of 2024. Seemed nice enough when Linda and I toured it. Clean hallways, decent food, activities room with a big screen TV. The director, this woman named Patricia Hawthorne, had that professional smile and handshake down pat. We'll take excellent care of your father, Mrs. Chen, she told Linda. Our residents love the sense of community here. What they didn't tell us was that Patricia Hawthorne ran that place like her own personal kingdom, and she had very specific ideas about what kind of residents fit her community vision. The trouble started on my 3rd day. I was in the common room trying to figure out the remote for that big TV when this soap opera comes on. Now, I've got nothing against soap operas, but this particular one had some scene with military guys, and they were getting everything wrong. Wrong uniforms, wrong terminology, wrong everything. So I made a comment, just casual-like, to the guy sitting next to me. Those aren't Marine dress blues, I said, pointing at the screen, and no Marine would wear his cover indoors like that. The guy next to me, this thin fellow with thick glasses, perked up. You served? Air Force, I said. You? Same here, maintenance crew at Da Nang, 68 to 69. Well, that got us talking, and before you know it, we're swapping stories. Nothing classified, just the usual stuff, what the chow was like, how hot it was, the buddies we lost. Normal conversation for 2 old Air Force guys who happened to find each other in a retirement home. That's when Patricia Hawthorne appeared like a storm cloud. Gentlemen, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, we've discussed this before. This facility maintains a peaceful, positive environment. Our other residents don't need to hear war stories during their relaxation time. I looked around the common room. There were maybe 6 other people there, all watching TV or playing cards, paying us no mind whatsoever. Ma'am, we were just having a quiet conversation. Mr. Henderson, I understand you're new here, so let me be clear about our policies. We don't discuss violence, politics, or traumatic events in our common areas. Many of our residents find such conversations disturbing. The maintenance guy, his name was Frank, I learned later, just kind of shrank back in his chair. This clearly wasn't his first run-in with Mrs. Hawthorne. With all due respect, I said, keeping my voice level, talking about our military service isn't discussing violence. It's just 2 veterans sharing experiences. Her smile got tighter. I'm sure you understand, Mr. Henderson. We need to consider all our residents' comfort levels. That should have been my first warning, but I figured maybe she'd just had a bad day. Maybe some resident had complained about something. I let it slide, but Patricia Hawthorne wasn't done with me. Not by a long shot. Over the next 2 weeks, she found fault with everything I did. I hung my American flag in my room window, against regulations apparently, because it might offend residents who prefer a neutral environment. I wore my old Air Force cap to breakfast, inappropriate headwear in the dining facility. I helped another resident fix his TV, unlicensed maintenance work that could create liability issues. The woman seemed to have a personal mission to make my life miserable, and I couldn't figure out why. I kept my room clean, paid my bills on time, didn't cause trouble. But every day brought some new complaint, some new rule I'd supposedly broken. The other residents started giving me looks. Not hostile exactly, but wary. Like I was the troublemaker Mrs. Hawthorne kept saying I was. Frank would nod to me in the hallway, but he wouldn't sit with me in the common room anymore. Word gets around fast in places like that. "Your father seems to be having difficulty adjusting," Mrs. Hawthorne told Linda during one of her weekly check-in calls. I wasn't supposed to hear that conversation, but sound carries in those places. He's very focused on his military background, which can be disruptive to our community atmosphere. Linda started calling more often, asking pointed questions. Was I taking my medications? Was I getting enough sleep? Was I maybe having some memory issues? The kind of questions that let you know someone's been filling her head with concerns about your mental state. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in June. I was in the dining room having coffee with this old fellow named George. Nice guy, used to be a machinist in Detroit before he retired to Arizona. We were talking about baseball. The Tigers were having a decent season, and George was excited about it. Somehow the conversation drifted to travel, and George mentioned he'd never been on an airplane. Always wanted to, but never had the reason or the money, he said. So I started telling him about flying, what it's like to be up there above the clouds, how different the world looks from 30,000 feet. Nothing dramatic, just trying to share something I'd loved about my service. George was eating it up, asking questions about instruments and navigation and what happens during turbulence. That's when Mrs. Hawthorne materialized behind my chair like some kind of evil fairy godmother. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice carrying across the dining room. "What did we discuss about appropriate conversation topics?" I turned to look at her. "I was telling George about flying, ma'am." He asked, "You were telling war stories again, despite multiple warnings about our community standards." "War stories?" I stood up, feeling my temper start to rise. "I was explaining how an altimeter works." "Mr. Henderson, please sit down. You're creating a scene." And that's when I realized what was really happening. Every eye in that dining room was on us. The staff had stopped serving, the other residents had stopped eating, and there I was, standing in the middle of it all like some kind of unstable old man who couldn't control himself. "I will not sit down," I said quietly. I was having a conversation with a friend about something I spent 32 years doing professionally. If you want to call that a war story, that's your business, but I won't be silenced like some kind of crazy person. Mrs. Hawthorne's face flushed red. "Mr. Henderson, you will sit down immediately, or I'll have to call security." "Call them," I said. So she did. 2 security guards showed up, young guys, probably in their 20s, looking uncomfortable as hell. Mrs. Hawthorne pointed at me like I was some kind of dangerous criminal. "Please escort Mr. Henderson to his room," she said. "I'll be calling his family to discuss immediate alternative arrangements." "Ma'am," one of the guards said, "he's just standing there. He's creating a disturbance and refuses to follow facility guidelines after multiple warnings." I looked at those two young men, and I could see they didn't want any part of this. But they had jobs to protect, and Mrs. Hawthorne was their boss. "It's okay, boys," I said. "I'll walk myself." But Mrs. Hawthorne wasn't satisfied with just the humiliation. Oh no, she followed me right to my room, talking loud enough for everyone in the hall to hear. "This is exactly the kind of disruptive behavior we cannot tolerate," she announced. "Some residents simply cannot adapt to community living standards. They bring their outside conflicts and traumatic experiences into our peaceful environment, and it affects everyone's quality of life." She kept going as I packed my few belongings. Military people often struggle with authority structures outside their comfort zones. They're used to violence and aggression as problem-solving tools. That's simply not compatible with our therapeutic community model. Every word felt like a slap. This woman was talking about me like I was some kind of damaged goods, a broken-down war machine who couldn't function in polite society. And the worst part was, there were other residents listening in the hallway, nodding along like what she was saying made perfect sense. Linda showed up 2 hours later, flustered and embarrassed. "Dad, what happened? Mrs. Hawthorne says you threatened staff and caused a disturbance." "I stood up during a conversation," I said. "Apparently that's threatening behavior now." "She says you've been telling war stories and making other residents uncomfortable." "Linda, I helped George understand how airplanes work. He asked me about flying, so I told him." But I could see it in her eyes. Her dad, the guy who used to fix her bicycle and coach her softball team, was now some unpredictable old man who got kicked out of a retirement home for being disruptive. Mrs. Hawthorne had done her job well. "Maybe we should look for somewhere more specialized," Linda said carefully. "Somewhere that understands veterans better." Translation: somewhere for the difficult cases, the ones who couldn't handle normal society. I spent that night in a hotel near the Phoenix airport, listening to jets take off and land, wondering how the hell my life had come to this. 79 years old, kicked out of a retirement home like some kind of delinquent teenager. My daughter thought I was losing it, and maybe she was right. Maybe I was just some bitter old man who couldn't adapt to civilian life, even after all these years. The next morning I was packing up to drive back to Linda's house when my phone rang. Unknown number with a Phoenix area code. "Colonel Henderson?" The voice was shaky, elderly, but somehow familiar. "This is Dutch Henderson, but I'm not a colonel anymore. Retired a long time ago. Who's this?" "Sir, this is Master Sergeant Billy Kowalski. We served together at Da Nang, 1971. You probably don't remember me, but—" "Billy Kowalski?" I sat down hard on the hotel bed. "Jesus Christ, Billy! From the 366th? How the hell did you find me?" "Sir, I'm at Sunset Manor. Been here about 8 months now. Frank Delacroix told me about what happened yesterday. He said there was an Air Force guy named Henderson who got kicked out for telling war stories." Frank. The thin guy with the thick glasses who'd asked about my service. He'd remembered. "Frank thought it might be you, sir. He remembered the name from when you visited the maintenance shop at Da Nang. Said you always took time to talk to the enlisted guys." The pieces were falling into place. "Billy, you're at Sunset Manor right now?" "Yes, sir. And, Colonel, there's something you need to know. Frank wasn't the only one who recognized your name. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. What do you mean? Sir, there are 12 residents here from the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing. We've all been here for months, some of us for years. We had no idea you were the guy who got kicked out yesterday until Frank put it together. 12 guys from my old wing, 12 guys who'd been at Sunset Manor, watching me get humiliated and thrown out like yesterday's garbage. And they hadn't known it was me. Billy, I said slowly, are you telling me that Mrs. Hawthorne kicked out a former squadron commander in front of his own men? Yes, sir. And Colonel? We're not real happy about it. I drove back to Sunset Manor with my heart hammering like a 20-year-old's. Billy met me in the parking lot, and damn if the years hadn't been kind to him. Still had that same grin, even if his hair was white now and he walked with a cane. Colonel Dutch Henderson, he said, snapping to attention as best he could manage. Permission to welcome you back, sir. Cut that shit out, Billy, I said, but I was grinning too. We're all civilians now. With respect, sir, some things don't change. He led me through the front doors like he owned the place, right past the reception desk where Mrs. Hawthorne's assistant was doing paperwork. The woman looked up, confused. Mr. Kowalski, visiting hours don't start until... This gentleman is here to see some old friends, Billy said, not breaking stride. We walked into the common room, and I swear to God, it was like stepping back in time 45 years. There was Frank Delacroix, looking exactly like the skinny maintenance kid I remembered, just with white hair and wrinkles. Next to him sat a guy I recognized immediately, Tom Bulldog Martinez, former crew chief, built like a fire hydrant then and now. Well, I'll be damned, Bulldog said, struggling to his feet. Dutch Henderson, you still look like a pilot, sir. One by one, they started gathering around. Jimmy Walsh from Supply, Eddie Kowalowski from the motor pool, Pete Garrison from Communications. Faces I hadn't seen in decades, but voices I recognized instantly. These were my guys, the men who had kept my squadron running during one of the ugliest chapters of American military history. How long have you all been here? I asked. I've been here longest, said a voice from behind me. I turned around and nearly fell over. Master Sergeant Charlie Brennan, my former first sergeant, the man who'd basically run the squadron while I was flying missions. He was in a wheelchair now, looked like he'd had a stroke, but his eyes were sharp as ever. 8 years for me, sir, Charlie said. These other knuckleheads started showing up about 5 years ago. Funny how us old Air Force guys end up in the same places. It's not that funny, said a new voice. We all came here because this place supposedly specializes in veteran care. That's what they advertised. I turned to see who was talking and got another shock. Major John Tracker Williams, my former operations officer, the man who'd planned half our missions over North Vietnam. He looked older than his years, walked with a pronounced limp, but that voice still carried command authority. Tracker? I said. What the hell are you doing here? Same thing you were doing until yesterday, Dutch, trying to live out my final years with some dignity. His face was hard. Unfortunately, Mrs. Hawthorne seems to think veterans are damaged goods that need to be managed rather than respected. That's when the whole story came out. These 12 guys, all from the 366th, had ended up at Sunset Manor through various circumstances. Some came because their families couldn't care for them anymore. Others came because they'd been told it was a veteran-friendly facility. A couple had been transferred from other places that closed down. What they found was Patricia Hawthorne's version of veteran care, which basically amounted to treating military service as a mental health problem that needed to be suppressed. She told my daughter that my military fixation was preventing me from forming healthy relationships with other residents, Charlie said, his words slightly slurred from the stroke, but still understandable. Recommended therapy to help me move past my trauma. She confiscated my squadron photos, added Pete Garrison. Said they were triggering for other residents who might have anxiety about war-related imagery. She banned me from wearing my Purple Heart pin, said Jimmy Walsh, pulling open his cardigan to show me the medal pinned inside, hidden from view. Said it made other residents feel excluded and uncomfortable. Jesus Christ, I muttered. Language, Mr. Henderson, came a sharp voice from behind us. Mrs. Hawthorne had entered the common room with 2 staff members flanking her like bodyguards. I thought I made it clear yesterday that you are no longer welcome on these premises. I turned to face her, and for the first time since arriving at Sunset Manor, I felt like myself again. Because I wasn't just Dutch Henderson, confused old man who'd been kicked out of a retirement home. I was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Henderson, and these were my men. Mrs. Hawthorne, I said, my voice carrying that old command tone that could cut through jet engine noise, I'm here visiting friends. These are my residents, and you are disrupting their routine. I'm calling security. You do that, said Tracker Williams, standing up despite his obvious pain. But while you're at it, maybe you should call the local news too. Excuse me? Charlie Brennan rolled his wheelchair forward. See, ma'am, we've been talking since yesterday, comparing notes about how you've been treating the veterans in this facility. Billy Kowalski pulled out his phone. Turns out, when you put 12 guys from the same Air Force wing in the same retirement home and treat them like damaged goods for long enough, they eventually start comparing stories. Mrs. Hawthorne's face had gone very pale. I don't know what you think you're implying, but this facility provides excellent care for all our residents, including veterans. Like when you told Mrs. Patterson that her husband's nightmares were attention-seeking behavior and refused to let him see the VA counselor, Frank asked quietly. Or when you banned Captain Morrison from displaying his Distinguished Flying Cross because it promoted militaristic values, added Eddie Kowalowski. Or when you told the activities director that Veterans Day programming was politically divisive and canceled the ceremony we'd been planning for months. This from Tom Martinez, whose voice was getting louder with each word. I was starting to understand the scope of what had been happening here. This wasn't just about me getting kicked out. This woman had been systematically silencing and humiliating every veteran in her facility, one by one, under the guise of maintaining community standards. Gentlemen, you're all clearly upset about Mr. Henderson's departure, Mrs. Hawthorne said, trying to regain control. But these conversations are exactly the kind of disruptive influence we cannot allow. This is why we have policies about... About what? I interrupted. About veterans talking to each other? About old men sharing memories with their friends? About residents who cannot integrate into our community model, she snapped. And there it was. The real truth. Mr. Henderson, some people are simply not suited for this type of living environment. Your obsession with military service, your need to dominate conversations with war stories, your inability to respect authority structures. Lady, said Bulldog Martinez, getting to his feet with considerable effort, you just insulted a lieutenant colonel in front of his men. And you are? Staff Sergeant Tom Martinez, Crew Chief, 366 Tactical Fighter Wing, and that man you just called obsessed and disruptive? He saved my ass more times than I can count. Mrs. Hawthorne looked around the room, and I could see the calculation in her eyes. This was getting out of hand. 12 residents, all backing the guy she'd just kicked out, all suddenly looking a lot less manageable than they had 5 minutes ago. "I think this conversation is over," she said. "Mr. Henderson, you need to leave immediately, or I'm calling the police." "Call them," said Charlie Brennan, "but while you're at it, maybe you should call the Department of Health, too. Ask them how they feel about a Medicare-certified facility that discriminates against veterans." That's when I realized Charlie hadn't just been sitting around for 8 years watching TV. The old first sergeant had been doing what first sergeants do best, keeping track of everything and everyone under his command. "Billy," I said, "what exactly have you boys been up to since yesterday?" Billy grinned. "Well, sir, once Frank told us who you were, we started talking, really talking, for the first time since we've been here. And we discovered some interesting things." He pulled out a folder from under his chair. "Turns out, when you get 12 guys who used to work in military administration together and give them nothing but time on their hands, they start asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "Like why this place advertises itself as veteran-friendly, but bans military photographs, prohibits service dog visits, and refuses to accommodate VA medical appointments," Tracker said. "Or why they charge a special care surcharge for residents who receive VA benefits." "They what?" I looked at Mrs. Hawthorne, whose face had gone from pale to gray. "Oh, it gets better, sir," Pete Garrison chimed in. "Show 'em the Medicare billing, Billy." Billy handed me a stack of papers. "Took some doing, but we got hold of our billing records. Turns out Mrs. Hawthorne here has been coding veteran residents differently than others. We're all listed as high-maintenance patients with behavioral complications requiring specialized management." I stared at the papers. The implications were staggering. "That affects reimbursement rates." "Sure does," said Charlie. "About 15% higher per resident. Multiply that by 12 residents over several years." "That's fraud," I said. "That's what we thought too," Billy said. "So we made some phone calls yesterday." Mrs. Hawthorne had been backing toward the door during this conversation, but now she stopped. "What kind of phone calls?" "Well," said Frank, speaking up for the first time, "I called my nephew. He's a reporter for the Arizona Republic. Seems like he's very interested in stories about veteran mistreatment." "I called the VA Inspector General's office," added Jimmy Walsh. "They were very curious about this billing discrepancy thing." "And I called my granddaughter," said Eddie Kowalowski with a smile. "She's a lawyer, specializes in elder law. She's driving down from Flagstaff as we speak." Mrs. Hawthorne was trapped in the middle of the common room now, surrounded by 12 old Air Force veterans who'd spent their careers dealing with much more dangerous situations than one corrupt retirement home administrator. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice shaking now, "I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," said Tracker Williams. "You kicked out our commanding officer for talking to his men. That's where you made your mistake." "Your commanding officer?" I stepped forward. "Mrs. Hawthorne, let me introduce myself properly. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Henderson, former commander of the 366th Tactical Fighter Squadron, Da Nang Air Base, Republic of South Vietnam, 1971 to 1972. These men served under my command during 47 combat missions over North Vietnam." Her eyes went wide as she started doing the math. "Master Sergeant Brennan here was my first sergeant. Major Williams was my operations officer. The rest of these guys kept my squadron flying when we were losing 2 planes a week to SAM missiles." I gestured around the room. "You want to talk about community? Lady, this is what community looks like." I had no idea," she whispered. "Because you never bothered to ask," said Bulldog Martinez. "You just saw a bunch of old guys talking about the military and decided we were problems to be managed." "You separated a squadron commander from his men," Charlie said quietly. "In our world, that's about the worst thing you can do." Mrs. Hawthorne looked around the room desperately, like she was hoping for backup, but her staff members had quietly disappeared. Smart move on their part. "Look," she said finally, "perhaps we can work something out." "Too late for that," said Billy, "because while we were making phone calls yesterday, we also did some other research." He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. "Turns out, this place has been cited 17 times by the State Health Department in the past 3 years. Most of the violations were related to inadequate accommodation of residents with special needs." "And there's this interesting pattern," added Pete Garrison. "Every single citation involved a veteran resident. Every single complaint was dismissed as behavioral issues or failure to adapt to community standards." Frank spoke up from his chair. "We also found the Yelp reviews. 7 different families mentioned that their veteran relatives were asked to leave because they were disruptive or couldn't adjust." "Which brings us to today," said Tracker Williams, checking his watch. "Because all those phone calls we made yesterday, they're about to pay off." As if on cue, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot, followed by 2 white vans with official-looking insignia. "That would be the VA Inspector General's team," Billy said calmly. "They drove down from the regional office in Albuquerque. Seems like they've been getting complaints about this place for a while now." Mrs. Hawthorne was staring out the window like she was watching her world collapse, which she probably was. "And those white vans?" Charlie added. "That's the State Health Department. Surprise inspection based on multiple complaints filed yesterday by concerned residents." "Oh, and Mrs. Hawthorne?" Pete Garrison held up his phone. "My granddaughter's law firm just filed a complaint with the Arizona Attorney General's office about Medicare fraud and veteran discrimination. They'll probably want to talk to you about those billing irregularities." The front doors opened, and official-looking people started filing in. Men and women in suits, carrying badges and clipboards and briefcases. Mrs. Hawthorne's worst nightmare, all arriving at the same time. "Mr. Henderson?" A woman in a navy blue suit approached me. "I'm Inspector Patricia Vance, VA Office of Inspector General. We understand you may have information relevant to our investigation." I looked around the room at my old squadron. 12 guys who had spent their careers following orders, keeping their heads down, trying not to make waves. 12 guys who had been pushed around and silenced for months or years told their service was something to be ashamed of, that their memories were trauma that needed to be suppressed. "Inspector Vance," I said, "I believe my men have plenty to tell you. What happened over the next 6 hours was something to behold. The VA investigators interviewed every veteran in the facility, taking detailed statements about treatment, billing irregularities, and discriminatory policies. The state health inspectors found violations in everything from medication management to dietary accommodations. And Eddie's granddaughter, a sharp young lawyer named Maria Kowalowski, arrived with enough legal firepower to level a city block. But the real show was watching my old squadron transform back into the unit they'd always been. Charlie Brennan, despite his stroke, still had the organizational skills that made him the best first sergeant in Southeast Asia. He'd been keeping detailed records of every slight, every violation, every instance of discrimination. Not because he was planning revenge, but because that's what good sergeants do. They document everything. Tracker Williams, my old operations officer, had mapped out the entire facility's power structure. He knew which staff members were complicit, which ones were just following orders, and which ones had tried to advocate for veteran residents and been shut down. Military intelligence training never really leaves you. Billy Kowalski had been building a network. He knew every veteran in every retirement facility in the Phoenix area, and he'd been quietly documenting patterns of discrimination across multiple facilities. Turned out, Sunset Manor wasn't unique. "Sir," he told me as we watched Mrs. Hawthorne get escorted out by the investigators, "this has been going on for years, not just here, but everywhere. These places take government money to care for veterans, then treat military service like a mental illness that needs to be managed. They separate us," added Frank, "make us ashamed of what we did, who we were, tell our families that our military experience is trauma that needs professional management. They silence us," said Pete Garrison. "No flags, no photos, no stories. Like 30 years of service was just some embarrassing phase we went through." Tom Martinez summed it up best. "They take our pride and package it as pathology." The investigation took 3 days. When it was over, Mrs. Hawthorne was gone, along with half her management staff. The state health department had identified 47 violations of elder care statutes, most specifically related to veteran accommodations. The VA Inspector General was recommending criminal charges for Medicare fraud. But the real victory came on Friday afternoon. I was sitting in the common room with my squadron, watching the news coverage of the investigation, when the new interim director walked in. Jennifer Harrison, former Army nurse, Silver Star recipient from her service in Iraq. The state had brought her in to clean house. "Gentlemen," she said, "I wanted to talk to you about some policy changes." She pulled out a clipboard, but this wasn't the kind of bureaucratic clipboard Mrs. Hawthorne used to wield like a weapon. This was a working document. First, the flag policy. Every resident has the right to display the American flag in their room or window. Period. No exceptions, no approvals required. A cheer went up from my guys. Second, the photography policy. Military photos, unit photos, family photos in uniform, all allowed anywhere in the facility. We're going to set up a display case in the main hallway for anyone who wants to share their service history. Third, the activities policy. Veterans Day programming is restored and expanded. Memorial Day programming is restored. Any resident who wants to organize military-related activities has full support of the facility. She looked directly at me. And fourth, the conversation policy. Residents may discuss their service, their experiences, and their pride in their military careers freely. Any staff member who suggests otherwise will be terminated immediately. Billy raised his hand. "Ma'am, what about the billing issues?" "Already resolved. The state is auditing all veteran residents' accounts. Any overcharges will be refunded with interest. The special coding system has been eliminated entirely." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and Colonel Henderson?" "Yes, ma'am." "Your room is available whenever you're ready to move back in. The management would consider it an honor to have you as a resident." That night I called Linda from my hotel room. "Dad, how are you doing? I've been worried sick since I saw the news." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually." "The news said there was some kind of investigation at Sunset Manor? Something about veteran mistreatment?" I told her everything. About finding my old squadron, about the systematic discrimination, about how Mrs. Hawthorne had been treating military service like some kind of shameful secret that needed to be hidden away. "Dad, I had no idea. When she called me, she made it sound like you were having adjustment issues, maybe some cognitive decline." "Linda, that woman was very good at her job. She knew exactly how to make veterans look like problems that needed professional management." "I'm so sorry, Dad. I should have listened to your side of the story. You believed someone in authority who told you your father needed help. That's not a character flaw, sweetheart. That's being a good daughter." We talked for over an hour. Really talked, for the first time since Sarah died. I told her about my service, about the men I'd commanded, about what it meant to find them again after all these years. She told me she'd never really understood why the military was so important to me, but seeing the news coverage had helped her realize it wasn't just a job. It was a brotherhood. "Dad, are you going back to Sunset Manor?" "I think I am. My squadron's there, and we've got work to do." I moved back to Sunset Manor the following Monday. My room was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. My American flag was hanging prominently in the window, and nobody said a damn word about it. The transformation of that place over the next few months was something to witness. Turns out, when you give veterans permission to be proud of their service, amazing things happen. Charlie Brennan started a weekly Squadron Stories meeting in the common room. Nothing dramatic, just old guys sharing memories of the people they'd served with. But those stories attracted other residents too. World War II guys who'd never talked about their service. Korean War veterans who thought nobody cared. Even some civilian residents who just wanted to understand what these old guys had been through. Tracker Williams organized a display case project that grew into a full museum corner. Photos, medals, unit patches, even some old flight manuals and maintenance guides. The families started bringing stuff in, uniforms, letters, citations their fathers and husbands had never shown anyone. Billy Kowalski became our unofficial liaison with veteran families throughout the Phoenix area. Word got out about what had happened at Sunset Manor, and suddenly we were getting calls from families whose veteran relatives were having problems at other facilities. Billy started a support network connecting veterans across different retirement homes, sharing information about which places truly supported veteran residents and which ones just used it as marketing. But the biggest change was in the guys themselves. Frank Delacroix, who'd been quiet and withdrawn when I first met him, started talking about his time maintaining those F-4 Phantoms at Da Nang. Turned out the man was a mechanical genius who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. The maintenance staff at Sunset Manor started asking his advice when equipment broke down. Pete Garrison reconnected with his family for the first time in years. His daughter had stopped visiting because Mrs. Hawthorne kept telling her that her father's war stories were signs of declining mental health. When she learned the truth, that her father had been a communications specialist who'd helped coordinate rescue missions, she started coming every weekend. Tom Bulldog Martinez became something of a local celebrity when the Phoenix newspaper did a follow-up story about the Sunset Manor investigation. Turns out, the Air Force cross citation he'd been hiding in his dresser drawer was for an action where he'd stayed behind during a base attack to make sure all the aircraft were secured, even though the area was under heavy mortar fire. The newspaper story led to an invitation to speak at Luke Air Force Base, which led to a whole speaking tour for active duty airmen. Even Eddie Kowalowski, who'd been one of the quietest guys in the group, found his voice again. He started teaching a basic automotive maintenance class for the younger staff members. Turns out, keeping Air Force vehicles running in combat conditions makes you pretty good at fixing things in general. And me? Well, I discovered that retirement didn't have to mean irrelevance. The squadron meetings that Charlie started grew into something bigger. We partnered with the local VA hospital to create a peer support program for newly retired veterans. Guys who were struggling with civilian life, feeling lost and disconnected, could come talk to us old-timers who'd made the transition successfully. We started a scholarship fund for children of active duty airmen, funded by donations from the Phoenix community after the story went national. The American Legion post down the road made us all honorary members. The Phoenix City Council issued a proclamation declaring the squadron an official community treasure. But the thing I'm proudest of happened 6 months after I moved back. I was in the common room with Tracker and Charlie planning our Veterans Day ceremony when Frank came up to us with a newspaper clipping. "Colonel, you need to see this," he said, practically vibrating with excitement. The article was about Patricia Hawthorne. After being fired from Sunset Manor, she'd been hired as director of a facility in Tucson. But this time, the veteran families were ready for her. The network that Billy had built had spread word about her methods, and when she tried to implement the same policies at her new job, she ran into a wall of organized resistance. The families had lawyers, they had documentation, they had 12 old Air Force veterans who were willing to testify about what they'd experienced under her management. Her new job lasted exactly 3 weeks before she was fired again. "Gets better," Frank said, grinning. The state of Arizona just passed new regulations for retirement facilities that accept veteran residents. They're calling them the Sunset Manor Rules. Any facility that takes government money for veteran care has to meet specific standards for honoring military service. Tracker looked up from the article. "They named regulations after us?" "Not just us," I said, realizing the scope of what we'd accomplished. "After every veteran who's been silenced, every family that's been told their father's service was trauma, every old soldier who's been made to feel ashamed of what he gave to this country. That Veterans Day ceremony we planned turned into something none of us expected. The American Legion brought honor guards from all 5 service branches. The local high school band played military anthems. The Phoenix mayor showed up with a key to the city for our outstanding service to the veteran community. But the moment that got to me, really got to me, was when they called me up to speak. I looked out at that crowd. Hundreds of people had showed up. Active duty military from Luke Air Force Base, veteran families from across the valley, staff from a dozen different retirement facilities who'd come to learn how to better serve their veteran residents. And right in front, in the first row, were my guys. 12 old Air Force veterans who'd proven that brotherhood doesn't end when you hang up the uniform. "My name is Robert Henderson," I said, "and I'm proud to be a veteran of the United States Air Force." The applause went on for 5 minutes. 6 months ago, I was kicked out of this facility for talking about my military service. The administrator told me that veterans are damaged people who can't adapt to civilian communities. She said our memories are trauma that disturbs other people. She said our pride in our service is obsession that needs to be managed. The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. She was wrong about every single thing. Veterans aren't damaged. We're experienced. Our memories aren't trauma. They're history. Our pride isn't obsession. It's earned. I looked at my squadron. But most importantly, she was wrong about community, because real community doesn't silence its heroes. Real community doesn't hide its history. Real community takes care of its own. More applause, and I had to wait for it to die down. The 12 men sitting in front of me today taught me something I'd forgotten. They taught me that retirement doesn't mean retreat. That growing old doesn't mean growing quiet. That just because we're not wearing the uniform anymore doesn't mean we stop being who we always were. I paused, looking directly at the families in the audience. If you have a veteran in your family, father, grandfather, husband, brother, don't let anyone convince you that their service is something to be managed or medicated or minimized. Don't let anyone tell you that their stories are disturbing or inappropriate or traumatic for other people to hear. The crowd was with me now. I could feel it. Because those stories, that service, that brotherhood, that's not the past. That's not history. That's who we are, and it's who we'll always be. I looked back at my squadron one more time. These men followed me through the worst war of our generation. Today, I get to follow them into the best years of our lives. The standing ovation lasted 10 minutes. After the ceremony, we all went back to the common room at Sunset Manor. There was food and drinks, family members mingling with residents, kids asking questions about our squadron photos on the wall. Jennifer Harrison, our new director, had set up a barbecue on the patio, and the smell of burgers and hot dogs drifted through the facility. I found myself standing with Charlie Brennan near the memorial wall we'd created. Photos of squadron members who hadn't made it home, guys who'd been shot down over North Vietnam or died in crashes during training, good men who never got the chance to grow old in retirement homes or argue with administrators about conversation policies. "You think they would have approved, sir?" Charlie asked, nodding toward the photos. "Of what we did here? Of us finding each other again. Of us standing up when it mattered." I thought about it for a minute, watching Bulldog Martinez show his great-grandson how to properly fold an American flag, watching Frank Delacroix explain aircraft engine mechanics to a fascinated teenager, watching Billy Kowalski swap stories with a young Marine who'd just gotten back from his second deployment to the Middle East. "Charlie," I said finally, "I think they would have said we did exactly what we were trained to do." Which was? We completed the mission. 6 months later, I'm still at Sunset Manor, and I can honestly say it's the best place I've lived since Sarah died. Not because the food is great, it's okay, or because the activities are exciting, they're not, but because I'm surrounded by family again. Billy Kowalski and I have breakfast together every morning at 6:30. Old habits die hard. We talk about everything: grandkids, politics, the state of the Air Force, whether the Diamondbacks have a shot at the playoffs. Just two old guys who've known each other for 53 years, enjoying each other's company. Tracker Williams and I play chess every Tuesday and Thursday. He still beats me about 60% of the time, just like he did when we were planning missions back in '71. We argue about strategy and tactics, and sometimes those arguments drift into stories about the war, and nobody tells us to keep it down or change the subject. Charlie Brennan holds court every Wednesday in the activities room, sharing stories about squadron life with anyone who wants to listen. His speech has gotten better since the stroke, especially when he's talking about the old days. Turns out, when you give a man permission to be proud of his life, his brain starts working better. Frank Delacroix has become the unofficial historian of the 366th. He's been corresponding with Squadron veterans all over the country, collecting stories and photos and documents. We're working on a book together. Nothing fancy, just a record of what we did and who we were. For our families mostly, so they understand what their fathers and grandfathers accomplished. The other guys have all found their places too. Tom Martinez teaches basic mechanics to the maintenance staff. Pete Garrison helps residents stay in touch with family members using video calls and email. Jimmy Walsh organized a food drive for homeless veterans in downtown Phoenix. Eddie Kowalowski started a car club for residents who still have vehicles, complete with weekly cruise nights through the desert. We're all still getting older, of course. Charlie's stroke has slowed him down, and Tracker's arthritis is getting worse every winter. Frank's hearing isn't what it used to be, and Billy's got some heart issues that keep him on a strict medication schedule. But we're aging together as a unit, and that makes all the difference. Last month, my granddaughter Emma came to visit for spring break. She's a junior at Arizona State, studying journalism, and she wanted to interview me for a class project about veteran experiences. "Grandpa," she said as we sat on the patio watching the sunset, "can you tell me about your time in Vietnam?" For years after I retired, that question would have made me uncomfortable, not because I was ashamed of my service, but because nobody really wanted to hear the answer. People would ask out of politeness, then change the subject as soon as you started talking about anything real. But Emma was different. She took notes, asked follow-up questions, wanted to understand what it was like to command a squadron in combat. She asked about the friends I'd lost, the decisions I'd had to make, the responsibility of sending young men into dangerous situations. "Were you scared?" she asked. "Every single day," I told her. "But fear wasn't the enemy. Shame was." "What do you mean?" "When I first got here, Emma, they made me feel ashamed of who I'd been. Like 32 years of service was something embarrassing that I needed to get over. Like the proudest moments of my life were trauma that disturbed other people." She looked around the patio where several of my squadron members were playing cards and telling stories to their own visiting family members. "But you're not ashamed now?" "How can I be ashamed when I'm surrounded by the finest men I've ever known?" Emma wrote her article, and it won some kind of college journalism award. But more than that, it helped her understand why her grandfather spent so much time at that retirement home with all the old Air Force guys. Because we're not just old Air Force guys. We're the 366th Tactical Fighter Squadron, and we're still on active duty in the war that matters most. The fight to age with dignity and die with honor. Mrs. Hawthorne probably thought she was dealing with 12 disconnected old men who could be managed individually, isolated from each other, kept quiet and compliant through shame and bureaucratic pressure. What she didn't understand is that you can't really retire from being a squadron. The uniforms come off, the ranks become meaningless, but the bonds remain. When you've trusted someone to cover your six at 30,000 feet over enemy territory, you trust them to cover your six in a retirement home common room. When you've relied on someone's expertise to keep your aircraft flying in combat conditions, you rely on their judgment about Medicare billing irregularities. When you've served with someone through the worst experience of your generation, you stand with them through the final experience of your lives. The stories we tell here now aren't war stories. They're brotherhood stories. They're stories about competence and courage and commitment that happened to take place during wartime. They're stories about young men who became old men without ever forgetting who they were or what they stood for. And if that makes us troublemakers, well, we've been called worse things by better people. Jennifer Harrison stops by the common room sometimes, usually when families are visiting, to see how we're doing. She always asks if we need anything, if there are any problems, any concerns about our care. "No problems, ma'am," Charlie usually tells her, "but if any arise, we'll handle them through proper channels." She grins when he says that, because she knows what he means. We'll handle them the way we always have, as a unit, with discipline and intelligence and absolute commitment to the mission. The mission now is different than it was 50 years ago. It's not about defeating an enemy or protecting American interests in Southeast Asia. It's about proving that veterans can age with dignity, that military service is something to be honored rather than managed, that brotherhood doesn't have an expiration date. It's about showing other retirement facilities that veteran residents aren't problems to be solved, we're resources to be valued. It's about demonstrating to younger veterans that retirement doesn't mean irrelevance, that there's still work to be done and still ways to serve. Most importantly, it's about making sure that no other veteran gets silenced or shamed for being proud of what he gave to this country. 3 weeks ago, Billy got a call from a veteran family in Tucson. Their father, a former Navy pilot, had been kicked out of his retirement facility for inappropriate behavior. The inappropriate behavior? He'd been teaching other residents how to tie nautical knots and telling stories about landing on aircraft carriers. "Colonel," Billy said after he hung up, "road trip?" 2 days later, 8 of us climbed into a van, the facility van with Jennifer's full blessing, and drove down to Tucson. We spent the day at that retirement facility talking to the management, reviewing their policies, meeting with the veteran residents who'd been staying quiet to avoid trouble. By evening, that Navy pilot was back in his room, the knot-tying classes were officially added to the activity schedule, and the facility director had requested Jennifer's contact information to learn about veteran-friendly policy implementation. "Sir," Billy said on the drive home, "I think we're pretty good at this community organizing thing." "We should be," I replied. "We've been practicing for 50 years. That's the truth of it, really. Everything we learned in the Air Force, leadership, teamwork, attention to detail, commitment to the mission, taking care of your people, all of that translates perfectly to civilian life. The only difference is the uniform. Mrs. Hawthorne couldn't see that. To her, we were just problems to be managed, difficult cases that didn't fit her idea of compliant elderly residents. She never understood that the qualities that made us effective military personnel are the same qualities that make us effective advocates, organizers, and community leaders. She thought she was dealing with 12 separate, isolated old men. What she actually faced was a squadron that had never stood down. Last weekend was the 1-year anniversary of what the local newspaper calls the Sunset Manor incident. The VA Inspector General's office sent a representative to present the facility with an award for excellence in veteran community care. The state health department declared Sunset Manor a model facility for veteran-friendly elder care. But for us, the real celebration was simpler. We gathered in the common room, all 12 of us, plus some of the newer veteran residents who joined us over the year. Jennifer Harrison had arranged for a cake that looked like an F-4 Phantom. The baker did his best, and someone had brought champagne. Charlie raised his glass, steady despite the tremor in his hand. "Gentlemen," he said, "to the 366th Tactical Fighter Squadron, still flying, still fighting, still taking care of our own." "To the 366th, we all replied, and the sound echoed through the common room like a war cry. Later that evening, after the celebration was over and the families had gone home, I found myself alone with Frank Delacroix in the activities room. He was organizing some photos for next week's Squadron meeting, handling each one like it was made of gold. "Frank," I said, "can I ask you something?" "Sure, Colonel." "When Mrs. Hawthorne was running this place, when she was making you feel bad about your service, did you ever think about fighting back?" He was quiet for a long moment, still sorting through the photos. "Every day," he said finally. "But I didn't know how. I mean, what was I going to do? File a complaint? Call my family and tell them the retirement home was being mean to me? Who was going to believe one old maintenance guy against a professional administrator? But when you found out about the other guys, when I found out I wasn't alone, when I realized that she was doing the same thing to all of us." He looked up from the photos. "Colonel, that changed everything." "How?" "Because suddenly we weren't 12 separate problems. We were a squadron again. That's the lesson of Sunset Manor, I think. That's what Mrs. Hawthorne never understood, and what Jennifer Harrison figured out immediately. Veterans don't just want to be cared for. We want to care for each other. We don't just want to be accommodated. We want to contribute. We don't want to be managed. We want to be led, and sometimes we want to lead. The brotherhood doesn't end when the service does. The skills don't disappear when you turn in your uniform. The commitment to mission and unit and country doesn't fade just because you're drawing Social Security instead of military pay. Hawthorne tried to convince us we were broken old men who needed to be fixed. What she didn't realize is that we were never broken. We were just scattered. Once we found each other again, once we remembered who we were and what we were capable of, taking care of one corrupt administrator was easy. Hell, we'd faced SAM missiles and MiG fighters and 122mm rockets. One angry woman with a clipboard wasn't even a challenge. These days, when new residents arrive at Sunset Manor, especially veteran residents, we make sure they know they're not alone. We make sure they understand that their service matters, that their experiences have value, that their voices deserve to be heard. And if they're having trouble adjusting, if they're feeling isolated or misunderstood or silenced, we introduce them to their squadron. Because everyone needs a squadron, especially when the mission is just surviving long enough to die with dignity. I'm 80 years old now, and I won't lie. Some days are harder than others. My arthritis is getting worse. My hearing isn't what it used to be, and I miss Sarah every single morning when I wake up. But I'm not alone, and I'm not ashamed, and I'm not quiet. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Dutch Henderson, United States Air Force, retired but not forgotten, surrounded by the finest men I've ever served with, still completing the mission after all these years. And if that makes me a troublemaker, well, I'm in good company. The 366 Tactical Fighter Squadron may have been deactivated back in 1975, but we never stood down. We're still here, still flying, still taking care of each other. Mrs. Hawthorne can take her community standards and shove them. This is what community really looks like.